Let's talk specifically today about contoured swale paths and their value in a climate where you can get a lot of rain or you can get very little rain. This is a contoured swale path that was roughly dug out, and then we put down cover crop and straw last fall. And you can see where the straw was put down, we actually have some cover coming up. And this is a very clay soil. I'm Justin Hitt from Prosperity Homestead. This is a very clay soil, but where there was no straw, there was no cover crop seed that it took. So you can see here, very little cover crop that is taken. Where over here we have a lot of cover, and we even have some greens coming in. Now these wider swale or trench walking paths are hard as a rock. But you can see where the water had soaked into the ground, and so actually right below the surface there is water, and you can tell by how the lower areas that are somewhat protected are getting the strongest and thickest cover crop, where in areas where there was no specific cover crop protection, like the straw, we didn't get any cover crop to go at all. Now this bare soil with sun and water will become hard as a rock, and that's what I'm dealing with right here. I'm actually trying to widen that path a little bit. You want your paths to be 2 foot wide to 4 foot wide enough for a wheelbarrow to get down and comfortable for a person to get through. You want them level on contour, but you're not always going to be able to get contour, so sometimes you have to put in these actual breaks. And you can see a particular break here. It has a back channel to allow water to come over. It's actually a bump to the ditch in the front and a pit in the back. And so when water came in from this side, it pitted up instead of running all the way across here. And then the water coming from that side came through here. And basically we allow the water to settle. These paths actually filled with water, a couple inches, and then soak that water down into the ground. Now, depending on your design, you could soak in a large amount of water at the top of the hill, and all that water come out in the seepage in the bottom of the hill. And we've actually got 2 more beds down on the bottom where we're going to deal with that and actually be watering our own beds with the water that's soaked into the ground from the sky. Now, we do have water out here, and we could water these plants, but again, these are cover crops. They're low value in the sense of edibles. And so we primarily just want to get the cover crops naturally going with a good seeding, and then a good, just a good straw or something to keep that cover going. Now, once that soil starts to get covered up, we don't have any more evaporation. The reason your clay soils will get hard as a rock when you have a rain and sun cycle is because the evaporation will pull out the majority of that water and leave behind a hard pan clay. So again, what we do here is we create the beds. These are permanent raised beds. We're going to dig these one time. We're never going to dig them again. Now we're going to keep digging out the paths. In fact, the paths themselves, if we have to answer the question, how can we retain more water? In the past, we'll actually put wood chips. We'll put all kinds of woody matter and brush and sawdust and wood chips and all kinds of scrap materials and crop residue, and we'll use that to walk on so that even in the wet season, we can walk the paths, which are a little bit lower in grade. You can see there's still moisture in here. We've had about 6 inches of evaporation the last couple of days, and some of these paths still have a little moisture in them. By filling them with woody material, we're actually going to be composting in the path itself. So at the end of the season, all the crop residue, all this rye when it gets taller and we cut it off, is going to layer on the beds as mulch, and the thick woody materials would lay in the paths as kind of a fodder that we'll step on, walk on. We'll crush it down, and then at the end of the season, or end of 2 seasons, we'll dig out the paths again and throw them up on the main beds. Now you can see some beds did better than others. Some of the beds you can see a lot of grass and cover crop coming along. And the other beds, the wind has blown off the straw and we see kind of a barren area. Now you can re-straw. You can come in and just keep re-strawing, put new layers of straw in. If you've got soiled straw, straw that is not really good for much, you can actually dry it out in the paths or spread it out in the paths to dry it, and then spread it on the beds as additional mulch. But we, again, all the crop residue, all this stuff is on the beds or in the paths. And so the crop residue becomes carbon that we're trapping in the soil. But again, we got to keep that soil covered. So there are times you may want to chip or shred your crop residue to throw on the bed. See, this bed here was just basically BCS'd out. I used the tiller to layer up the beds. Now we could keep going back and forth until we get a nice wide bed here with the BCS and throw those mounds up. We could do that, or we could just every so often move on, because we got a lot of area to cover here. But you can see how it's in the paths. The water had set, soaked in, the clay dried out. There's not enough organic matter. And see, over here we strawed out the area. There's not enough organic matter to keep the moisture near the surface so that the seeds can germinate and then continue to grow. Now you might be wondering, well, Justin, I see a lot of ridges in here. I see there's more cover crop in the bottom of the path than there is on the sides or sometimes the top of the beds themselves. Well, depending on your season, we're creating a lot of microclimates here, and some parts of that microclimate may be better suited for your cover than other parts. So we do have some scorching. We do have some areas that came out better than others. The goal here, though, is to grow as much carbon per square foot as possible to layer back into the beds so that we don't need as many acres of straw to keep mulching. And then also that all of our crop residue, see all these pepper plants and stuff here, all this crop residue, as we put in new plants, the crop residue can be used as climbing materials. It can be used as additional mulch. It can be used in the paths to make the paths nice and dry. But we can bring in the widest variety of materials. So you can see up there, there's a bunch of shredded wood. And I'll strip that out and bring it down here and put it in some of the paths. But what we're doing here is we're covering the soil with as much loose organic material, loose carbon material, so that we can get cover crop in place, and then we have a blanket of roots protecting our soil. And so we're in various stages here. The top beds look better. And some of these beds will be planted with perennial plants. Some of them will be, the greenhouse will take out small start plants and we'll get them in rows. And the beds are about 4 foot wide. And some of the paths are 2 foot to 4 foot wide, depending on what's going on. Now you might be thinking, Justin, well, the wider paths, they take up space in the garden. You're not going to have as much square footage to grow in. Well, remember, these raised beds, we can grow on the tops and we can grow on the sides. On the sides of the mounds, we grow cover materials, greens, kind of seeds that are broadcast. So you can see here, we've got greens coming on here. And that's in the side of the hill. And then when the greens are done, we come through with a machete, or we come through with a scythe, and we just cut the sides, cut all that grass down, throw it on the top as mulch, plant our starts in the top, so our tomatoes and our peppers and our different eggplants, different plants that start with seed starts. But we continue to have nitrogen fixing plants on the side, and we can shave down the sides and again mulch the plants on the top. But we don't dig into the sides. The sides are secure, and eventually over time we'll have a consistent and constant cover. Usually a clover, a ryegrass, some kind of consistent cover, which again is the root structure that holds our mounds in place, locks in that moisture, and the same thing can happen with the paths as well. Now these paths, the 4 foot wide paths, are wide enough I could bring a tiller down them, till up the soil, scrape off the soil, throw it up on the beds. Now I've got another layer of soil on the beds. I've got a more level path. I have a harder surface to move water around, but that's not entirely desired. You can actually just throw wood chips on it and walk on level wood chips. You don't actually need the soil to be level. But again, the wider path also lets me get a big cart through. So when we're harvesting vegetables, we don't have to carry them out to the ends of the rows. So we might be losing a little bit of square footage, but our paths also give us enough space that we can harden off plants in the paths. You can put hoop houses you can put a hoop over the path itself, put out your plants that you want to harden, and then as you take them out of hardening, you can actually put them in the beds themselves. So there's a lot of things you can do, but the key is we want accessibility. We want to be able to move water and nutrients across the growing areas. We want to secure the space overall, can see the paths are different lengths. They're all on contour, but some are different lengths and different widths because we're using the space that we have. So you might say, well, Justin, you're losing a little bit of space, but now I'm actually gaining access to space that wasn't normally available. We're also making the whole area erosion stable. And see, you can see how the water is actually going to set at different levels. So imagine you've got your vegetables 3 to 4 feet high, and you've got a little bit of shade on the beds, and then you get a good rain, and that water spreads out in the paths, and then you have a low evaporation because you have a little bit of ground cover. That water is going to soak into the ground, and the roots of your plants are going to run deeper. Because again, remember, your vegetables are on the mounds. Now, you don't walk on the mounds, you just lean into the mounds and you can pick your vegetables. But the vegetables are on the mounds, and then the water soaks down and creates a lens underneath the mounds, and then they drive those roots down there to get it. And we're gonna have a lot of greens off of here just from the cover crop itself. But again, it's a double reach bed. I can kneel on the edge if I had to. I could just squat down and I could reach the center of the bed. And this is a new bed. These are new beds. Next year, you're gonna see it thicker, kind of like the ones at my house. You're going to see it thicker with greater cover, more organic matter, and you can literally, if you can get some cheap round bales, if you can get some straw, you could just keep layering in materials. And again, here's another one of those little bumps because we're moving into a slope. So I dug a pit out in the back here, and it keeps this section level. Then the water drops down to this next section that's level as well. Now, if you're going to have contour rows and you have a hilly area like this, you will have to have different directions and paths, and you know, it's a little bit more organic, but that's okay. It's all about spreading and soaking the water. And you can see a couple more little pits here and there. And by the way, you might be concerned that somebody's going to step in a pit and break an ankle. Well, you actually just take a wheelbarrow load of mulch and dump it in the pit. The key is that you're soaking water in the ground, you're taking all the energy out of the water, and if there is any surface run, because you can see the areas that didn't get strawed out completely, there is a little surface running. But I want that to run down here into this little pit, and then I could dig out this little pit rather than the soil running all the way down the hill and getting off here. Now, when I talked about layering things in the paths, so if you're putting all your crop residue in the path, you're dumping manures in the path between the seasons, and you're creating compost in the paths. Every time the water comes through and it rains, nitrogen's water soluble. So you'll actually be spreading that nitrogen through the garden, and you won't lose any of those nutrients. Now, you don't have to do compost in the paths if your materials are, for example, there's rabbit manure here, and there's aged cattle manure. Well, you can just throw that right on the beds, and then again, if it rains and you have any runoff, it's caught in the ditches, in the walkways. And they are ditches, they're contours, swales, micro swales, whatever you want to call them. But any nutrients that leach off the beds themselves will get caught in these pans and these basins, and they'll spread out in the growing areas. And some of these basins cascade into other basins, and essentially what will happen is if we get a heavy rain, let's say we get 4 inches of rain in a couple hours, these things will fill up and they'll just move that water all over the property rather than pulling the water off of the growing areas. And these beds, they're actually, they've got a little bit of rocks in them, but they're actually, they're not that thick. They're not that hard. You can, put a potted plant in there. You take a plant, you grow it in the greenhouse, and then when it's a start, you come out here and plant it in the beds with, high density space, your spacings with high density, and then you can top dress with straw. Before you get into it, you can top dress with manure. But again, it's not about tillage. We might till or we might plow to get the initial framework. But once the framework is in place, we simply layer in new materials. We simply manage our crop residue with chop and drop. We bring in additional materials. So it can be animal manures. It can be crop residue from elsewhere on the property. It could be wood chips or any type of organic waste. We're actually going to grow some biomass on the bottom down there so we can chop up sun hemp, for example, and use sun hemp as a fertilizer. You could have been using straw bales for this to hold down a big plastic. We're doing a solar kill out there just to show you how it works, and since we already had the plastic. And then after it's done, you take the straw and you just come out here and layer it on the tops of the beds. Do you see how that works? Now we want our thinner, more fine materials on top of the beds, and we want our more coarse materials in the pathways. Now you might be asking, well, what about chickens? Can you have chickens in here on this type of system to prep these beds? Well, you can. You just want to make sure that the way you put the chickens in is conducive to maintaining these outside ridges. So these little outside ridges here, you don't want chickens on them. So you'd put see where these stakes are? You'd put your fence like inside of this mound. So you'd come over here and see the bird poops and stuff. You'd put the stake over here somewhere, and you wouldn't let the chickens on this mound, but you would let them all the way into the path, because it's a terrace, it's a micro terrace, and this channel on the back is kind of just spread the water around. But we want to, if the chickens spread that all out, it's okay. You can just clear the path back out and throw it back up on the beds. But you don't want them to dig the slopes. You don't want them to burrow in the hill on the downslope. So it's a very versatile system. It's a system I use on uneven ground. It does require a little bit of work, but the work could be done incrementally as I'm taking a little break from just scraping this out and getting that path cleaned up. And then it's something you can put in place with a plow or tiller. It's a contour plow method, and in fact, there's a little bit of natural vegetative slopes. So the contour mounds that are at the lower end of each bed are actually vegetative strips. So you're growing grasses on them, you're growing small vegetables, you're growing fibrous things that will get a good root mass, and then you're just maintaining that hill. So for example, when you dig out the materials from the paths over the years, you're going to throw them over top of the lower mound. If you want more details about this and how to make this work for your garden area, click the link below and join our mailing list. Please ask your questions. We got a lot of nuances here that you can learn on site. But ultimately what's going to happen is we're going to end up with nice terraces, small terraces that are connected to wide garden beds, and then an on-contour walking path that has, it's just a little bit lower than the main grade, so that it actually spreads and soaks water. And then every year it gets less and less maintenance. It can be managed with hand tools at this scale or bigger, and you're simply working through the sections, and each year adding up more and more and more this thin biomass. You end up with beds that are very like porous. So the lower mound might be a hard clay and might be covered with grass, but the upper mounds will be very soft, and you could just use a hand trowel and put your plant starts in. It's not going to take seed after a while, and we talk about that in our grass-fed gardens. But ultimately, it's a structure that can take heavy rains. We get 40 inches of rain here in Martinsville, Henry County area. It can take heavy wear and tear, meaning you can move through these paths for a long time before you're going to have any problems. And you're not going to get a hard pan because all the beds are permanent raised beds. And it stores and conserves your nutrients. So you can grow cover crops. Every winter you can actually grow cover crops in the paths. And then you can cut those cover crops and then throw them up on the beds. And you kind of get twice the mulchability. I just rave about this type of system. It's worked well for me. It's worked well for a lot of other people. And you'll also see this system in Rwanda and other places that have heavy rainfall but hot summers. You'll find this in European temperate climates, and you'll find just slight variations with perennials on scales as large as acres. Thanks for watching. I'm Justin Hitt with Prosperity Homestead. Click the link below and visit me at www.prosperityhomestead.org. And we've been talking about contoured swale paths with permanent raised beds and a unique system that works on slopes. Actually, it works on level ground too, but it works on slopes really well. Thanks for watching.